Janice Fiamengo is a professor at the University of Ottawa who is recently retired. She's also a thought leader in the current culture war. She's made a number of viral videos around feminism and about how she herself is now an anti-feminist. She's also a great writer. She wrote this article for C2C Journal about Jordan Peterson and about how he's getting mobbed by the woke left. Today, we're going to be speaking to her a little bit about her background and about this Jordan Peterson article. I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's not only about cancel culture, it's about getting mobbed, it's about humanity. So I think it's a deep topic you're going to enjoy. I'm Angelo Sidoro, and this is Cancel This. Okay, Janice Fiamengo, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for speaking to me.
Well, I've been following you for a few years now. I remember all throughout university, your name kept coming up. I know you were a teacher, a professor at the University of Ottawa. You're retired now, is that correct?
Yes, I retired in June 2019.
So what's that like, the retired life away from the belly of the beast of academia?
It's Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I'm very happy to be out of academia. I liked a lot of things about academia. I liked the chance to discuss books with people, and I loved the chance to write articles and try to have them published in my specialty area. But I didn't like the toxic political environment at all, even though there were a lot of nice people in my department and elsewhere in the university. Well, you know what it's all about, and I found it increasingly uncomfortable to be in that environment, and I resented being in a position where I had to be concerned that a student might complain about me if anything I said in class made him or her, more likely her, feel unsafe. And to be aware of that all of the time is just an incredible disability. So yeah, I'm happy to be able to just say whatever I want and do my thing without worrying about being hauled before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal.
Yeah, well, it's so fascinating to hear. And I think it's sort of sad in terms of the state of affairs where you feel more liberated now outside of academia than you do when you were in
Hmm.
it. It's really telling of the current university system. I
It's
remember
incredible.
there's a video of you that has, a ton of views online, and it's really how I discovered you, which is you're giving this speech or this lecture, and it's sort of a Q&A, and every single question, they're obviously good questions, but you were just getting mobbed by these like radical feminists. And it's just really crazy to witness that, because I think you're sort of one of these figures that have been defined by others, defined by these radicals as like a dangerous figure, when in reality, like, you seem like a really nice person. So what is that like to deal with that sort of mobbing? I mean, I don't know if you're dealing with it now because now you've sort of retired and moved on, but you were pretty involved in the culture wars. So what is that like to have been dealing with that?
Yeah, it's a weird feeling. It's, as you say, to be expressing ideas that, from my perspective, are very reasonable and middle of the road. I mean, I mainly came forward as an advocate for men's issues because that seemed to me to be something that I knew intimately and could talk about, having been a fairly hardcore feminist as a graduate student, and then having moved away from feminism as an ideology because I saw that it wasn't true. And my experience of being a teacher from the earliest days when I started at the University of Saskatchewan was to note that my male students, who were far outnumbered in my classes by female students to begin with, it was like 80 to 20% in most English courses, and to note that my male students didn't have privilege and power. They were not entitled. They were not complacent in their toxic masculinity. They didn't have any of that feminist ideology claimed. In fact, they had the opposite, and they had to sit there and listen to lectures day in and day out about how their sex was responsible for all the ills of the world, and if only they would step back and allow their superior empathetic sisters to come forward, there would be no more war or economic inequality, homelessness, or injustice. And I just started to think about the psychological assault that ideology represented, to be told that not just by a few individuals, but by your professors in nearly every course you took, if you were a student in the humanities or the social sciences. So, so that was what I was talking about. And that was received as if it were some kind of call for women to be raped and violated every day on campus. Even, I think maybe the Q&A that you saw might have been at the University of Toronto, which was the very first talk I ever gave, and I was totally unprepared. I mean, I don't watch that Q&A because I thought I did a terrible job. I wasn't ready for any of those questions. That was in the spring of 2013, and they pulled the fire alarm at that talk. The level of hysterical, I would say, anger and self-victimization on display amongst those radical students. I wasn't exactly surprised because I'd grown up in that, I knew it, but to have that directed against you when you're simply trying to say, look, feminist ideology presents a picture of the world that is demonstrably exaggerated and in some cases completely untrue. Can't we all agree that men do not, in 2013 as it was, possess the kind of privilege that feminism declares they do? But nobody was willing to do that, and that was taken as some kind of defense of the right of men to rape women with impunity. So it's a strange experience. It got weirder as time went on. I tried to give a talk at the Ottawa Public Library, I think in 2017, I think, or maybe 18, and basically Antifa formed, a human chain around the entrances to the library and harassed every person trying to get into the library, most of whom are elderly or poor people. Harassed and intimidated those people and chanted "fuck Fiamengo" outside the library for hours, eventually pulling the fire alarm in that case as well and preventing the talk from going forward. So it got a bit tiresome, really, although I can't say that, I found it traumatizing or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, tiresome. I think that's an understatement, right? I mean, you mentioned that you weren't overly prepared for your first lecture there. It's like, well, how could you prepare? How could you prepare to get mobbed? Who gets prepared to deal with a mobbing from radicals who, they're not acting in good faith, right? They're not interested in actual dialogue. So it's
No.
interesting to me. Feminism is so tricky because when you say you're an anti-feminist, the notion that is perceived or that they use to sort of publicize is, well, if you're anti-feminist, it means you don't want men and women to be equal and you're evil. And, at least for me personally, what I did to sort of better educate myself is I actually took a feminism course when I was in university. So I went straight to the belly of the beast. And I understood that you have your first wave, which is, voting rights. You have your second wave, which took place in the 60s, which was sort of Simone de Beauvoir and liberating women from the house and that sort of thing. And now you're in this third wave where I suppose the notion is that the second wave didn't address intersectionality enough. And is at least to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it is the third wave that has become more polemic in the way that it behaves, in the way that it sort of correlates feminism to even ideas of class, of privilege, of oppressors and oppressed. That to me is where I think the problem is that it's justifying essentially some forms of different Marxism to promote feminism. So it's to me it's unfortunate. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is that a sort of good analysis of what modern feminism looks like?
Well, I would argue, and my analysis has probably become um, more extreme over time, but I would argue that the resentment, the deep resentment against men, in particular against white men, and the implicit assumption, if not the overt assertion, of female superiority, female moral superiority, and the moral superiority of victimhood in general. I would argue that that's there in the first wave right from the very beginning, but is not as overt. And it's worth saying that feminism has always been obviously a diverse movement. There have always been actors in the feminist cause who were more reasonable than others, who didn't actually hate, who didn't create a political ideology based on resentment. But there always were those involved in the movement who did hate and who did create their ideology and their activism on the basis of resentment. And you can go back to the earliest feminists of the 19th century or even back earlier and find assertions of female superiority. In fact, one of the most famous of Canadian feminists, Nellie McClung, who is considered maybe one of the most lovable of early 20th century suffrage advocates. If you read her book, In Times Like These, which was published in 1915, which I just recently went back to and reread, I had read it as a graduate student, it is full of the most crude anti-male assertions that you could imagine, and full of the most rank idealization of women as entirely benevolent, that when women voted, all wars would cease. Like, she outright makes those kinds of claims. And, hatred of men is there in the second wave feminist movement very strongly as well. And particular blaming of white men. You can see it right from the beginning in writings by Robin Warhol and certainly Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon and various of the second waivers. So intersectionality, which of course, yes, does much more strongly attend to other kinds of divisions between people, especially racial divisions, and focuses much more of its animus on white heterosexual men rather than just on men in general. But it was there in the second wave as well. So I see it as a really divisive and unhelpful, untrue movement from its very beginnings, even though some of its specific causes were legitimate.
You can listen to my full conversation with Janice Fiamengo on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also find her work on the Fiamengo File on YouTube or the C2C Journal online. I want to thank her for coming on. I also need to remind everyone that the Post Millennial now does have a store with some amazing merch, including beanies, mugs, and t-shirts. I highly recommend you go to thepostmillennialstore.com and shop today. Until next time, thank you so much.